it's Shannie from Mountain One Product Stained Glass Studios. Come solder a Cardinal with me. Chip, chip, chip. First up, I like to squeeze the excess flux off my brush so it doesn't spatter all up in your face hole when you're trying to put the hot iron on it. You flux first. And I got this little squirter dude. Little bottle and spray it on your sponge. That's how you clean your soldering iron off. If you don't, your solder's going to fall off of it. It won't want to stick. Unwrap a little bit of your solder. I like to cut it off just because it's easier to hold a smaller piece like that than the big Hawkins spool. You can do it however you like. And I'm going to tin first. Putting a super thin layer of solder all over the whole piece. This will not hold your piece together. You are going to have to solder. Do nice rounded domed beads and nice rounded domed edge beads. But this does help to fill in any gaps. It's also kind of like priming before you paint. It makes a nice surface, even surface for your solder to adhere to when you're ready to do your full solder beads and your edge beading. And it will keep your piece together instead of just doing little tacks, little tiny spots of solder when you go to flip it over. Now we're going to do the other side. You might have noticed I put that flux brush in a separate jar. I do that because you still have quite a bit of flux in like the brush bristles. So rather than having to dip and squeeze it out all the time, I stuck it in that separate jar. When it needs a refill, then I'll redip. Like now, when you're edge beading, you want to really slap that flux on because you want it to run down over the sides. Right now I'm just tinning the edge, and then we'll be doing our actual edge beading next. One of the girls in my membership community, she had asked for where she could get a Cardinal pattern, and she was referred to Etsy, which there are some fantastic patterns on Etsy. And there are also ones that look fantastic because the illustrators can be really good. But the important thing to remember when you're looking for patterns is to understand the structural integrity and the structural requirements of stained glass. You can be an amazing illustrator, but if you don't understand the structural requirements for stained glass, you end up with jump rings in the wrong spots that can fall off. You can end up with hinge points, which are weak areas in your glass that can hinge and break off very easily, sometimes even under their own weight if it's a larger piece. And even things like balance points, where you put your jump ring does matter as far as balance goes too. You don't want to go to hang your bird and he's upside down, unless that's what you were going for. And now I'm doing the edge beading. I'm using that clamp because the glass is quite hot. It'll get hotter as you go. However, it's never a bad idea to use a little silicone glove or those UV gloves, the temperature resistant gloves, because you can drop little solder BBs on your hand and it's freaking hot. I'm double gloved here, so I generally don't burn myself. But if you want to be smart, don't put your hand underneath where you're soldering, and wear the protective gloves too. If your edge beading is looking a little lumpy, you can always go back over it and make it nice and even. If you are looking for a Cardinal pattern, I did make this pattern available on my website. And if you'd like to hang out with some other glass hoarders, come check out my stained glass membership community. We're ridiculously fun, if I do say so myself. As you can see here, I'm just taking a little bit of solder and connecting one point to the next point, to the next point, to the next point. Sometimes you have to go back over a little bit so you're even. If you end up getting little points, like they stick up on your edge beading, add more flux. If your solder ends up dripping off the side of your piece, sometimes you may need to add a little more flux. Or if it's dripping or you have like way too much on your iron, another thing could be if it's falling off before you even really get it to your piece, you need to clean your iron tip, because your iron tip has to be kind of tinned and primed where it doesn't want to hold on to your little BBs of solder. Now we're going in to solder our regular lines. And again, you want nice rounded domed beads. Soldering is something, getting good at it is something that takes time, and definitely learning the right techniques off the bat will help you a ton. And I do have soldering classes, and I do live workshops in my membership community too, if you feel so inclined, but you can always ask me questions here too. And I'm going back over and remelting. Get a nice even line. Now we're letting it cool a little bit before I flip it over and do the other side. Fan it, cool off. If you don't let it cool a little bit before you go to the other side, sometimes it's too hot, and when you flip it to the other side and you start soldering, it'll leak through back to the original side. Same thing will happen if you stay on a spot for way too long. It can leak through to the other side. So if you have a spot that's just giving you trouble and you feel like you've been on there, you know, more than, I don't know, a couple seconds or so, step away from it for a moment, let it cool, reflux if you need to, and go back in and have at it to fix it, rather than staying on it and staying on it and staying on it and staying on it. If you do that too much, worst case scenario, crack your glass, but at very least, you end up with a schmecking through one side, schmecking through the other. Back and forth, back and forth. I have a little more than I wanted there, so I'm pulling it off to the side and bling, flinging those little solder BBs. You can collect them later and use them when you're pinning, or collect a couple of them and use them for an edge bead or when you're attaching your jump ring, because solder ain't cheap. You're never going to solder perfectly because we're freaking human. But I do think it's important to try to do your best, you know? And the longer you do it, the better you get. But I do get a little anal retentive about soldering for myself, and I'll go over things, you know, multiple times to make sure it looks as nice as it can look. Right now I'm just doing a quick double check here. Whoop! For the best spot to place the jump ring, which I was 98% positive when I drew it was going to be at that wing connection area, but I wanted to make sure before I did it. Time to add the jump ring. Always remember to solder the open end of the jump ring soldered into your bead. If you happen to forget and you realize later, you can always, and it's like up towards the top or something, obviously your hanger, like your fishing line or whatever you're using, your chain can slide right through it, so that's bad. But if it ends up happening that you forgot to bury it in your solder line, you can always go in, flux that opening, make sure that it's tight together, but flux that opening and put a little bloop of solder on it, and it'll kind of melt right around that jump ring and close it up for you. But the best is always to bury it in the solder. And my head's in the way. Sorry about that. I love the face shield because it really protects you from any kind of solder spatter that might happen at some point. But it gets in the way sometimes. Now I'm just doing a really thorough check of my edge beading, making sure everything's even, I didn't miss any spots. And this little point right here is going to make me freaking nuts, so I'm going to fix it real quick. Okay, that's better. Phew. Let it cool. Alright. He's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to clean this up a little bit, and I'm going to add an eyeball. What I'm using is 18 gauge pre-tinned copper wire. You can find all the stuff I use on my favorite tools and supplies page. And I just spun it around a little bit with rosary pliers. And now I'm debating, does it look too much like glasses, or does it look like an eyeball? There's quite a few glass paints on the market too, and I've been experimenting with a lot of different ones lately. But Cardinal's eyeballs are black, and so is that piece of glass. So you wouldn't really see it anyway. So we're gonna go with this monocle spectacle wire situation. 'Cause it's art. We can do whatever we freaking want. This is just a dowel that's been sharpened in like a pencil sharpener. Just so it has a little point so it can hold down stuff like this. Because you definitely don't want to be holding that with your finger. That wire gets so hot so fast. Most of the time, when you go to put wire work on your piece, you want to do it, unlike when you're soldering your flat lines, like your regular lines, There, you don't want to use too much flux because it spatters. But when you're attaching a little piece of wire on, you do have to use a little bit extra flux. And this guy was giving me a heck of a lot of trouble. Because sometimes that just happens. Sometimes you have to go back over and heat it a little more. Because you're heating it. On this one, I'm heating it into the solder bead. Other ones, you'll put a little tiny, like, little blob on top of the wire where it attaches on the solder bead. So you'll see a little raised little bloop. Sometimes for decorative purposes. The easiest way to attach wirework is always going to be while your piece is still warm, while your solder beads are still warm. And now we're just wrenching it around a little bit. Get it where it belongs. Okay, that's all right. And it's making me nuts because you can see the end of the wire here. Picking up just a little bit more solder from some of those little BBs that come off. And I'm sorry you can't see past my huge heat again. But I'm just doing the same thing I was doing before. I'm just remelting a little bit. So you can't see where the wire attaches. It is your choice how anal retentive you want to be about that. Okay, I'm going to leave well enough alone now. Quick double check. Yep, we're hanging a balanced way. That's right where we want it. Very good, very good. Remember, if you want this pattern, check it out on my site. Subscribe for more. And peace, love, and stained glass. Bye.